Revolution. The American Revolution had its cannons and guns. The Industrial Revolution was made possible with factories. But what's so amazing about the Neolithic Revolution, which was the shift from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural communities, is that this revolution had its humble beginnings in a tiny little seed. Historical records indicate that beginning after the last ice age, around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, the development of agriculture, which occurred at several locations throughout the world, laid the basis for early civilizations. In ancient Mesopotamia, we see wheat and barley being domesticated around 10,000 years ago. Around that same time, the ancient Chinese domesticated millet and rice, the ancient Mesoamericans domesticated squash, and the ancient Andean civilization domesticated potatoes. Additionally, in Mesoamerica, maize was domesticated around 9,000 years ago, and in the ancient Andean civilization, quinoa was domesticated around 7,000 years ago. Here to explain more about how the Neolithic Revolution laid the foundation for civilization is author Tom Standage.
So to understand how agriculture sort of leads to civilization, you have to start with what was going on before agriculture, which was that people lived in nomadic groups of hunter-gatherers. But one of the drawbacks of that kind of lifestyle is that you can't accumulate stuff. You have to carry everything with you all the time. And as part of this, the hunter-gatherers were eating wild grains, so things like wheat and barley. The interesting thing about grains, though, is that you can harvest them and you can dry them and you can store them. The problem is you can't then go very far from the places where you've hidden these stores. Another thing you can do with those grains is that you can sow them in the ground so that when you next return to a place, there might be, a bit more barley than there would otherwise have been, or a bit more wheat. And so what we see happening just before agriculture takes hold is this gradual shift where hunter-gatherers start to become gradually more reliant on these crops that they can deliberately cultivate. And that's the sort of point at which people have tipped into a farming lifestyle. It was not a deliberate choice, but once you've done it, the alternative is, well, you could let half of your village starve and you could all move somewhere else and go back to hunting and gathering. So what farming does is it supports a larger population and a settled lifestyle, and that opens the way to this whole new style of living where instead of wandering around in a nomadic band, you're living in the same place, and that's a new thing. And it spreads because essentially you can support more people with this lifestyle, and so you squeeze the hunter-gatherers in the areas between the farming areas and they become farmers too. And the other thing it allows you to do, because you're now settled down, is you can start to accumulate goods. You can start to, keep stuff, whether that's food or other things, and that leads the way to greater social complexity.
Throughout the world, as societies became more complex because of farming, agriculture was the catalyst for the development of farming technologies that accelerated the growth of civilizations. For example, the Indus Valley civilization created wooden plows to be pulled by cattle. The ancient Chinese invented water wheels for grinding grain and irrigation. The ancient Egyptians built nilometers to measure the Nile River water levels, and the ancient Andeans even found their own special fertilizer. Here to talk specifically about the agricultural innovations pioneered by the ancient Mesopotamians is anthropology professor Lisa Mahar.
In the lower part of Mesopotamia, which is where both the Tigris and the Euphrates kind of meet right at the coast, you have irrigation. So people learn very, very quickly that when there's not a lot of water around, but the soils are really fertile when there is water, you can actually capture that water and funnel it to go into the places that you want. And so they start a whole very elaborate system of irrigation pretty early on in the Neolithic and Chalcolithic and Bronze Age. So between 8 and 10,000 years ago, they really start dramatically shaping the local environment to make it more and more suitable to be farming, essentially, to be growing crops and to be looking after livestock animals in order to support these growing villages. And so there's all kinds of interesting technological innovations that go alongside changing the food that you eat, kind of on a primary basis. And so you start to see greater and greater organization in these communities, including the development of social hierarchies, systems of government and administration, especially to look after and manage all the labor that's needed to look after, build, and then look after these canals, to manage large agricultural fields. And so you start to see a long or not long after a reliance on agricultural ways of life, you start to see the increase in community size and community complexity and the beginnings of urbanism. So the whole origins of agriculture isn't just about people imposing their will on these plants and animals. It's actually about human societies also changing drastically as they negotiate new relationships with plants and animals.
Of all the developments that were introduced because of the shift to agriculture, perhaps the most revolutionary was the creation of social inequality.
So once again, if we go back to hunter-gatherers, they've got this very egalitarian lifestyle. It's not really possible for someone in a hunter-gatherer band to have more stuff than everyone else because they're going to have to carry it around. They're going to be slower. They're going to get left behind. And in fact, if you look at modern anthropological studies, and I mean in the last couple of hundred years of surviving hunter-gatherer bands, it's really interesting. They have these kind of rules in many cases where they pass around shared items because they're trying to break the connection between any one individual and that object. And this kind of makes sense because if everyone in the band has a knife and a net and a bow, then everyone is weighed down by all of this stuff. So you're kind of incentivized to share stuff. But once you settle down, once you've adopted farming, you can accumulate stuff. And initially this would have been grain in particular. So some of the people doing the farming would have just been better at it than others. They'd have ended up with more grain. And of course that would allow them to trade this surplus grain that they didn't need to feed their families for other things. So grain is power. It's kind of money. And if you're someone with lots and lots of excess grain, you can have a party. You can have everyone round. You can put on a big meal for them. And of course then they're all in your debt. And what this eventually turns into is that the big man in a village or in a particular area becomes a sort of clearinghouse for surplus food. They're good at accumulating themselves, but if you've got a bit extra, you might give it to the big man, and then you can call in a favour later on, and he'll give it to someone else who needs it, and he's sort of coordinating the behaviour of the community, naturally becomes the community leader, and can coordinate when planting and irrigation and harvest happens, and you can see how this becomes the basis of sort of political power. You also at this point start to get specialisation into different roles. So again, if you've got a wealthy person, a big man in a village, they can say, well, will you make a bow for me? And if you're really good at bows, you might be able to make your living just making bows for people. So you don't actually go hunting anymore. You basically make bows for other people and they pay you in food. And you start to get the beginnings of artisans and craftsmen and clerks they can figure out how to keep track of what's going on. This is also when you get the origins of writing. And of course you get priests as well. You often have a religious justification for this kind of redistribution. And so you see this social stratification happening in the Bronze Age. And this is a few thousand years after agriculture has been adopted. And it's the technology of farming, of being good at that technology, that leads to these social hierarchies and the social stratification. And, the people who are the best at exploiting that technology end up being the richest people. And of course, that's exactly what we see in society today.
So, while we have the Neolithic Revolution to thank for all the luxuries and technologies that come along with civilization and modern society, it's also interesting to realize that our modern social inequity had its roots in the success of a modest farmer thousands of years ago.